to live up to up here, and I hope I can with what I want to say to you today. Bill introduced me as having spearheaded the Free Gaza movement, or the boat movement, to break the siege on Gaza. That is what I've been doing for the last 2 years. But I need to explain that and stress that what we do, what we've been doing, and with the aim of the flotilla in breaking the siege on Gaza, it's not just about Gaza. We don't intend to separate Gaza from the rest of the occupied territories. What's happening in the West Bank and Jerusalem is not any less important or severe. Israel continues to confiscate land, demolish trees and livelihoods, build an apartheid wall, separate families from each other, demolish homes. In Jerusalem, they're not only demolishing homes, but they're actively kicking Palestinians out of their homes so they can move in Jewish families. You have situations where Palestinian families in Jerusalem are living in tents right across the road from their home. Also the situation in 48 Palestine. In the part of Palestine that became Israel after Israel was established in 1948, what's happening there can be described as discrimination. It can also be described as apartheid. We are second or even third-class citizens. We are unequal in almost every way. Israel basically tolerates us as a minority, but nothing more. This is all part of a colonial apartheid system that needs to be dismantled. And therefore, us sailing to Gaza isn't just about Gaza. Yes, we want to break the siege, and we focused on Gaza because the situation there for us represented the epitome of the world community turning its back on modern-day crimes against humanity. But more importantly, we want to mobilize international civil society to stand up to this kind of injustice, to stop Israel from doing what it's doing. The Free Gaza movement has its roots in the International Solidarity Movement, which was founded in 2001, mainly to operate in the West Bank, Jerusalem, but also in Gaza. We called people from all over the world to come stand with us in the occupied territories. Come stand with us, see with their own eyes what's happening, march with us. That way, maybe Israeli soldiers would not use the lethal kind of violence they use when Palestinians march alone. That way you can tell your media what's really happening. Palestinians don't hate Jews, don't hate Israelis. This is not Muslim and Christian versus Israelis. This is freedom versus occupation. And we need help in getting that message out to the dominated and controlled international mainstream media. Also, the volunteers that come to the occupied territories go back to their home countries and engage in advocacy. One thing that we've heard about is boycott, divestment, and sanctions, a very important part of our nonviolent resistance to Israeli oppression. And the people that come over give Palestinians a sense of hope. They are not forgotten. Because the international laws that exist on the books, human rights, humanitarian law, they don't seem to apply when it comes to Palestinians. And I usually give an example when I was teaching at Woods University in an International Human Rights and Humanitarian Law clinic, where my students would tell me, "This is all nice, miss, but it doesn't apply to us." They didn't feel it applied to them because nobody held Israel accountable for these violations when they were committed against Palestinians. When we first started the International Solidarity Movement, we were able to send volunteers to Gaza. In addition to mobilizing in the West Bank and Jerusalem, we would send teams of volunteers to Gaza. Now, Gaza, the situation was a little bit different, or actually a lot different. One of the differences I'll point out is in the West Bank, we were able to proactively organize actions, demonstrations, marches. Israel would set up a checkpoint, we'd take it down, we'd march against checkpoints, roadblocks. We would try to use our bodies to block the demolition of Palestinian homes. In Gaza, it was a lot more difficult to do that, because Palestinians and the internationals that came in solidarity were not be in solidarity with you, and we aim to get information out about what's happening. Volunteers would record, they would talk to the media, they would stay with families in areas that were constantly under fire. But then in March of 2003, March 16, 2003, one of our colleagues was killed by the Israeli military. 23-year-old Rachel Corey, an American citizen, and you'll hear from her mother, Cindy Corey, tonight. She was run over by a bulldozer and killed when she tried to prevent the demolition of a Palestinian home, the home of a family that she had been staying with. And then less than 3 weeks later, another one of our colleagues, 21-year-old Tom Herndal, was shot in the back of the head as he tried to move Palestinian children out of the line of Israeli fire. He noticed 2 children frozen with fear as bullets were ricocheting off the wall behind them. He went over to them, picked one up, moved her, went back for the second, and as he bent down to pick up the second child, he was sniped in the back of the head. He lay in coma for 9 months and then he died. Also within the same time period, a British journalist by the name of James Miller was shot and killed by Israeli forces in Gaza. So around this time period of spring 2003, Israel was getting a little bit of criticism because it had killed or lethally injured internationals. Never mind the hundreds, even thousands of Palestinians that they had injured and killed. When you have internationals injured or killed, at least someone takes notice. And so Israel came under some criticism and therefore decided that it was going to make it a lot more difficult for anyone to get into Gaza. Now, Gaza has always been closed off to the Palestinians, but prior to spring 2003, if internationals wanted to go, they could go down to what's called the Erez checkpoint, show your passport to Israeli soldiers, get checked, and go in. For however long you wanted to stay, then come back out. After spring 2003, you couldn't do that anymore. If you wanted to get into Gaza, if you had business in Gaza, you had to apply for permission at least 5 days ahead of time from the Israeli military's Southern Command, and you had to wait for approval. And to get approved, your purpose for going had to be something that the Israeli military and government recognized as a legitimate reason for visiting. And visiting friends or family was not a legitimate reason to go into Gaza. They only granted access to people working for mainly international organizations recognized by Israel, like the United Nations, or journalists that were registered with Israel's press office. The International Solidarity Movement, we couldn't send volunteers to Gaza anymore. So from 2003, we were cut off. In 2006, after the Palestinian elections,